week, we discuss the ranch and sporting property market, buying and selling advice, the latest best stewardship practices, as well as topics currently impacting landers out there. Mer Ranch Group is a full-service ranch real estate brokerage and consulting company focusing on legacy ranches and sporting and conservation properties around the West. Today, we're going to be talking about something that is vastly important to what we do, especially in the West. We're going to be talking about title work, and the importance of that from a seller and a buyer perspective, as well as why it's so different and important in the West as compared to the rest of the country. Thank you to everyone who has submitted questions. We'll try to get to them on this broadcast, but if not, we'll get back to you after this and respond to the best of our ability. Helping us out today is a good friend of ours. His name is Erik Anderson, and he works at one of our favorite title companies, Land Title. Mer Ranch Group uses Land Title as a preferred partner in the state of Colorado for most of our ranch transactions when we can. We trust them and we use them wherever they do business, where we have ranches. And the reason we do that is we have this connection with Erik Anderson. He answers questions whenever we have them. And when problems arise, we know Land Title will be able to fix it and walk us through it. So without further ado, here is our good friend, Erik Anderson of Land Title. Welcome, Erik.
Hi, Haley. How are you?
I'm so happy to have you on here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for including Land Title on one of these sessions.
Oh, no, this is great. And as I said previously, title work, and it's something a lot of people don't know a lot about, but it's super important. So we're just glad to have you here so we can discuss about it. And I'm excited to potentially see you and Holly this week at Young Guns too. So I get to maybe see you twice in 1 week.
For sure. We are looking forward to the Young Guns. It's a great event, the National Western, and part of the kickoff really to the National Western Rodeo season. So awesome. We're looking forward to it.
Will be great. So thank you again for having us. We've really enjoyed your friendship over the years, and kind of your connection with Land Title has helped us kind of navigate a lot of hairy situations with ranches. So thanks for being on today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So I guess we'll kind of start at a very basic level. Just to those of you who are watching, what is title and what does a title company do?
Yeah, great question. So my brother has asked me this question actually recently. So the analogy I used is, when you buy a car, typically you get title, and that demonstrates ownership of that car. When you then sell that car, you convey that title to the next owner. Where in real estate, fee simple real estate, title is just one of the parts of the conveyance. And so the conveyance from one owner to another is really done through a deed, typically a warranty deed. That can be a general warranty deed or a special warranty deed, but a deed type, and which is recorded, right, with each of the counties, which is then searchable, and anybody can find out who owns that parcel. And title, what we provide are really two pieces to the closing process, which is the actual closing of it, which is taking in funds and dispersing funds, but then also the actual title piece. And title, we provide a title commitment, which shows the title requirements to close on the transaction, but then also the title exceptions, the requirements being Schedule B1 of the title commitment, and then the title exceptions being B2 of the commitment. Once the requirements are satisfied, we can close. And after closing, typically within 30 days, we provide the title policy, which is what people then can hold and file for future use and any title claims if they shall arise.
Okay. So as we were alluding to, it's very important to kind of go through this title company. And what's great about having a title company on your side is you guys kind of help walk through the process with these buyers and sellers. So just kind of alluding to what you were talking about with that. And then one of the very important things with title is just title insurance overall. Can you kind of talk to us a little bit about what the title insurance is? Because I think that is sometimes confusing to people.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question, and it certainly can be convoluted at times. But to try to make it more simple, it protects owners against ownership claims against land and ranch with ranch and farm assets, right? And so it's the only title insurance that I know of that is an historical insurance, is protecting against the past rather than protecting against the future. It's a little bit of a mind shift if you think about that. It's a one-time premium, and as we're protecting against the past, we're looking at things like or protecting against things like forgeries, forgotten heirs, or other claims by anyone who may legally, unbeknownst usually to the current owner, have a right to the property. And the policy provides protection to the owner and to the heirs for as long as they own the property.
And that brings up a huge, title we kind of were talking about at the beginning is very different in the West because of what you were saying, the different ownership, the settlers that came out here, the kind of the lineage of ownership. And some of that is a little gray. When you come out West, and there was a lot of different things happening back in the 1800s when people were out here. So, that's a great segue into kind of our next focus is, so now that we've looked at the basics, the Intermountain West, how is title different out West and why is it so important? And I guess we'll start from a historical perspective, where did title kind of start, surveying, ownership, deeds, all of that when the Wild West was happening?
It was certainly the Wild West. And what's fun about certainly the transactions that Mer Ranch Group is involved in is, for a historian, this is, this is it, right? This is the bee's knees, because you can see, as part of the U.S. government bequeathing land to landowners in the late 1800s as part of the Dawes Act in 1887, we see that original deed from the U.S. government to the first individual. And there are times when it's a requirement because it's an older property that hasn't transacted in a long time, that we're actually searching all the way back to what we call the patent search, which is to that first time conveyance from the government to the individual. And so you can see families who homesteaded essentially and have been in the West for a long time. And in the state of Colorado, it's always fun to see family names who are still in the state of Colorado doing something. Maybe they own land, maybe they don't. But there are certainly a lot of people whose family have, generations and have been here since, what we would call day one.
I know, Ken unfortunately has COVID, so he could not join us today.
Sorry to hear that.
I know he nerds out hardcore when he sees a patent that was signed by the president with the name, the original owners. It's a really cool, I nerd out even too when I see those things when we look at the string of title.
Yeah, it's really impressive, of course, with the handwriting, because, I would have been fired after the first deed I would have written. But the folks that were writing these deeds that, were digitized even, and we're now finding the digital copy, still work, right? They're still legible. It's really fascinating, and how perfect the handwriting was back in the late 1800s that provide us enough information to show really valid ownership conveyances.
That's such a good point. I would have been fired too. Don't worry. Don't worry. I would have been right there with you. And I guess, that's, we, with all of that, the Wild West, the land ownership, when you're buying a house or you're buying on the East Coast, it's a little bit more like, I helped a friend buy a house recently, and the title objections was something we even breezed by because it's just very concrete. But when it comes to land and ranches, why is it so much harder, to figure out title and to figure out that kind of ownership?
Yeah. Many times compared to residential, even when we bought our house, there were no exceptions. There were only closing requirements on the title commitment. That makes a title officer's job very easy and makes a buyer and seller's job very easy when it comes to the title due diligence. But usually we're talking about, meets and bounds, which we'll get through, but these are larger chunks of land with more challenging chain of titles. Many times the ranches have been owned by families who homesteaded, which we discussed, which can create some murky ownership, some risk associated with previous heirs. And sometimes these things include neighboring parcel leases, right? And it's very complex, right? And I haven't seen a ranch yet or farm yet where the fences are where they should be, right? It's kind of the West way. When you start looking at boundaries and fences, it's never perfect. And that's kind of the mentality of the West, which is, you may get a little bit of mine, I may get a little of yours, but we're neighbors and we're in this together, being ranchers and farmers. So
yeah, and sometimes you even find ranches where there's no fences at all, and that's
right.
where
Right.
that neighbor camaraderie is even more important. Or like a river is the boundary, or things like that. So when it comes to something like that, what are some of the tools that a title company will use to know what an owner owns outright?
Oh, that's a big question, especially when we're talking about these types of properties, right?
Yeah.
And we want to get to a legal description at the end of the day, and the legal description at some point probably had a surveyor used. Typically, larger sections of land, I should say, larger parcels or larger ranches may be one full section or multiple sections. Sections are 640 acres. Those are much easier for us to search because, if Haley Murr owns this section, then we just go search that section, right? That's 640
Right.
acres, super easy. It gets a little bit more challenging when the properties get smaller as well. And so really, it starts with the United States Public Land Survey System, which utilizes sections, which is the basic unit, 640 acres. And then the next biggest unit is a township, which is 36 sections arranged by a 6x6 square, measuring 6 miles by 6 miles. And sections are numbered, beginning with the northeastmost section, proceeding west, and then south. And so, and I know in the state of Wyoming, for example, there's always one township, or one section rather, within a township for a school acres, right? And that was designated back in the West, that allowed schools to be designated in one specific place, in Wyoming, for example. And that's not the case in Colorado. But then we use ranges, and then we use range lines, township lines, principal meridians, and baselines. And those are kind of beyond essentially title companies. Those things are established by surveyors. And so if we don't have a good legal description from a previous transaction, surveyors can get involved and create that legal description. But anytime with any of these properties, that's a pretty time consuming and expensive, request at that time.
And a lot of times, as a broker, what we try to do before we even get under contract with a buyer and we have a listing, we get something called like a TBD title commitment. And we work with Land Title a lot on those because you guys provide those for us, just to make sure, beyond some of the other stuff we'll talk about, like encumbrances and things like that. If there is a survey, some of these places haven't been surveyed in a very long time, or those surveys are outdated. And a lot of times, a title company needs a more updated survey. We'll talk about a little bit of that. But a lot of these things as a seller, you should be kind of handling before even going in under a listing agreement, because this is going to come up at some point in the lifetime of the listing and the contract. So to your point, these legal descriptions are super important, and surveyors are very necessary. But in the wintertime, those surveyors sometimes won't get out there. So it's a very seasonal thing that you should be handling. We're dealing with a couple of those right now. So that's why
I bet you are. I think we're handling some of those for you. So
yeah. So and to your point, are all ranches surveyed? Or is it kind of a case by case basis where these surveys will come out?
Case by case, and it really depends on previous ownership. Hope at one point it was surveyed, but again, if it is just one section of 640 acres, maybe it wasn't surveyed and doesn't need to be surveyed. but it can be surveyed and does provide, any potential buyer in the next transaction, more assurity of what they are buying in terms of the boundaries within the property. Certainly gives us more meaningful understanding of the property as well.
Mm-hmm. And another person that, surveyors are there, but also lawyers. So if, we'll say that a couple times in this discussion. We're not lawyers, brokers
Sure.
or Erik. So
Yeah,
make sure
yeah.
you also have someone like that looking over.
No doubt. And, usually, the bigger parcels can sometimes be easier. Again, to my example of if Haley owns 640 acres, that's easier, or multiple sections without them broken down. Once they start getting broken down and they have smaller pieces of sections, it becomes sometimes a little bit more difficult to search.
Okay. And in those cases, sometimes you rely more on the meets and bounds that you were talking about a little bit earlier. Can you tell us a little bit about what a meet and a bound are? Because I don't think a lot of people have heard of that.
Well, it's a great question because legal descriptions really come in two formats. One is lot and block, and that's after a subdivision has been made. And so, you see that more in urban areas. Sometimes subdivisions, of course, can be in rural towns as well, usually towards the town center. But as you get outside of that town, most of the legal descriptions come in meets and bounds. And surveyors are the ones that really come up with that legal description. And so it utilizes a physical feature system of local geography. And I'm going to read this so I make sure that I'm right. But it's along with directions and distances to define and describe the boundaries of a parcel of land. The boundaries are described in a running prose style, working around the parcel in sequence from a point of beginning, returning to the same point. And so sometimes that even refers to adjoining parcels and their owners, and sometimes can even refer to later surveyors. And so it really is, if you read one of these legal descriptions, you can track it as literally just as a layman, like, okay, well, it's so many feet or so many yards to a specific point. And sometimes even surveyors, probably less now than in the past, actually made markers. And in some of these, we'll even, trees were not a good designation point because obviously trees fall over, but, more permanent structures within the landscape. So if there's a large rock, for example, that rock could be utilized in the legal description. And so really it would allow anybody to get at one point of the property and walk the boundary reading the legal description. And that is the prose style, what surveyors are very accustomed and relied upon to produce.
Okay. So for instance, like y'all's ranch up in Greene County, is like the river would be maybe something they would use as a boundary.
Yeah, rivers would be tough because rivers change so much, right? And so and we'll go through this a little bit, but actually rivers, that's a great question, because rivers can actually be excluded somewhat. I should say there could be exceptions based on riverfronts because rivers change. Okay. And so rivers are very dynamic, as we all know in the West, depending on drought years, depending on flood years. And so banks change and waterways change. So that's one of those things that would not be included typically in a meets and bounds legal description.
There's a great example of that. There's a property just outside Kremling. I forget the owners, but the Colorado River goes through the property and you can see an aerial view of, this was way back in the day, but where they changed the direction of the river. It used to kind of go through the ranch like this, but they wanted a more direct flow. But you can see the aerial. You can't do that really anymore, but this is back in the day. They diverted the river. No John Duntons out there,
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's like the old John Dutton way of changing a riverway, which is just throw some dynamite at it. I'm sure that's very okay in 2020 and 2022. No, we don't see that.
So I guess that brings up, we'll go into a little bit more about the specifics of who pays for title and those things. But because we were talking about some of the things that are insured through title, I just wanted to go through that because that's probably the most important part of title is the insurance component that you were talking about, insuring the past and the deeds and all of that. And while some of those might be insured, there's a couple things that aren't insured. So I'd love to kind of go through that for our viewers today.
Yeah, love it. So in most cases, the seller pays for title insurance for the buyer, and the seller then splits the closing fee with the buyer.
Okay.
But this is also negotiable within the contract. But typical market and typical terms are that the seller pays for the buyer's title insurance, and then they split the closing fee. And then what's insured and what's not, most folks who are new to buying, larger parcels of land think that everything is included with the conveyance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the warranty deed actually provides, that the legal description, and that's the true conveying document that's recorded, as we discussed. But within title insurance, we have title exceptions in Schedule 2B of the title commitment, and then eventually, of course, the title policy. And these title exceptions can include a couple of things that are very meaningful in farm and ranch properties. And we'll start with the biggies, which are water and mineral rights. And title companies do not provide any insurance on water or minerals. Now, we will show the severance of water and mineral rights within the exceptions, and showing the reservation of those minerals the first time. But from there, it is we rely upon our ranch group to provide an attorney to the buyer who knows that specific area, as an expert in water and mineral rights.
Mm-hmm.
So, and do you have a lot of that when you guys are brokering these transactions?
It's definitely a misconception. So when and we try to educate our buyers and sellers as best we can, but there's always another side to the contract that maybe hasn't been educated. So just making sure everyone's aware of that, like you said, the water and mineral rights, while we can determine they're being conveyed through lawyers and some documentation like bargain and sale and all of those, that isn't a part of the title, and that isn't insured through the title commitment. So I think we do get that question a lot when we're kind of going through the process of due diligence. So it is important just to allude to that. And if water and mineral rights are important to you as a buyer or seller, then having a lawyer that specifies or has a relationship with those things and is specifically good at water rights, we lend them a hand and get them the right lawyers to help them out with that.
Absolutely.
So that's a big one.
That's a really big one for both of us as we're working through customers. A couple of more things that items that are not included in the title insurance: ditches and canals, usually owned by somebody else, that are running through private properties. And then access, there's usually some access or easement allowed, right away or right away easement that allows folks who are maintaining those ditches and canals. So that's really important to understand. Railroads are a big one, right? If that runs through the property, understanding again access and any easements associated with the railroad. And again, increase and decrease. We talked about this a little earlier, the increase and decrease of land adjacent to rivers, right? And so that can change. Mining claims. I'll tell you, if you give mining claims to a title searcher examiner here, that's about as hard as it gets, because they're old and they're convoluted. And then any kind of rights recorded by highway departments, Department of Transportation, and then terms of restrictions, any kind, if there are, this happens obviously in subdivisions, master plan communities, and more urban areas where HOAs have declarations and there are rules associated. There are rules included in the declarations, limiting factors. We do not insure those limiting factors. And we see that, and you do see that in some of these more, I don't know what you would call them, kind of group ownership, common ownership ranches.
Shared ranches is our
shared There you go. Love that. Shared ranches who have common ownership in, common buildings and common, areas within the ranch area. So we would not insure some of the declarations restrictions set forth there. Forest road easements, water sharing agreements, gas pipeline easements, telephone right-of-ways.
Which then, the telephone right away, to your point, that's becoming more and more of a thing out west with some of those wind and solar projects that are going on. A lot of new things are being put towards or through ranches. So that's just a big one to point out.
Yeah, and the last one, just as everybody's kind of getting an idea of what's excluded with title insurance, are conservation easements. Very important, right? What a wonderful tool for a lot of families, and they are recorded, and that then will be shown. And so, as you were indicating and kind of telling everybody, it's important to know as a buyer or seller what you have through the due diligence period of the contract process, and that would be a big one to understand.
That's a big one. And so one of the things that does help with some of this coverage of things that you do insure is something called OEC. So when you do have a survey and it's something that can be reviewed by the title company and it's up to date and all of these things, a buyer can receive OEC and that's, again, owner's extended coverage. So if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's very common if there's a survey on the property, then folks will request OEC, the owner's extended coverage that we're talking about. And that's a couple of things. Any facts, rights, interests, or claims not shown in public record that could be ascertained by the inspection of the land, easements, liens, or encumbrances not of record, anything that would have been shown in a survey, and any mechanics liens not of record. And so it just, surveys provide us a level of comfort of we get more comfortable with a property if we see the survey, and so we're willing to give additional coverage. And if that, I will tell you, that's probably the cheapest, I should say, coverage that we provide. It's your biggest bang for the buck. I think it's $100, and can really come in handy in any kind of future claims as needed.
And I can say, just from a broker's perspective, most of our clients, we try to emphasize that and push the OEC if you're a buyer, just because it is, one, like you said, it's an affordable option, but it really does cover you for all of these unknown things that might have not have shown up otherwise. But then that also comes to the survey. A lot of our properties go under contract in the winter, and getting a survey done in the wintertime in order to get that OEC is sometimes difficult. So planning ahead, maybe, if you are very interested in a property as a buyer and you want that, maybe do it in the spring, maybe do it in the summer, because it is, to your point, just, it makes a lot of sense to just go with that and cover yourself as much as you can. So
yeah, the cost is not on the title side. The cost is really on the survey side. So.
Yeah. So it's perfect. And with that, all of this can seem a little overwhelming because there's a lot of things that you're insuring against. There's a lot of things that maybe you're not insured for. There's a lot of words we've probably thrown out between the beginning of this live stream to now that might not make sense. So just for the viewers out there, if you're considering buying or considering selling, kind of going through just a quick process of, what is important in your perspective, Erik, and then I can kind of give a broker's perspective of kind of that process.
Yeah, fantastic. So really, and we've alluded to this already, it's really good to have a title commitment started and maybe even in hand before a contract is signed, even for brokers or a seller or buyer to understand, what is actually being purchased. And what do I mean by that? The exceptions, right? It's like the title requirements to close is one thing, and that's like a statement of authority if they're buying in an LLC, to clear off a deed of trust, which is really previous debt by the owner. Those are things that everybody understands and you need to get through. But it's the exceptions when I say got to understand what you're actually buying and not buying and allowing on the property through easements, right of ways, and access. And so sellers like to understand exactly what they're going to be marketing to.
Right.
You would call it marketable title, right? Which is like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, now I know when somebody's asking us on a ranch tour, what's the scoop with that ditch that's going through the middle of the property. You now know.
Right.
Who has access, where they have access, how often they have access, that type of thing. Super important. And then as that happens, and then you all go through your negotiations, there's a signed contract. You all send that contract over to us, and then we, will update if there's any time that has gone by between doing the TBD and getting a signed contract. We will then update that commitment, update the parties on the commitment, and send the commitment out to all of the parties, including the transaction. And that's typically the buyer, the seller, brokers on both sides, attorneys on both sides, if there's a lender by chance, that type of thing. So those parties understand, what's happening and the requirements to close and the exceptions there. And then we go through any additional research to get that commitment out. I will say, and backing up a little bit, sometimes we have the digital data to support the search and examination, quote unquote, in-house. And then sometimes we don't, and we have to send somebody to a courthouse. That is not too uncommon, as you and I know. We have to talk about timing and sometimes how these things take a little longer than, a lot block in Denver. Somebody's got to go to the courthouse in Delta County to understand what was happening from 1900 to 1950, I think it is, for that campus. Oh, don't quote me on that. And so, and then, by that time, you're reviewing the title at that point with your buyers, right?
Yeah, and I think to your point, as a representative of a buyer, going through that. And I know, for instance, there was a problem in Wyoming. I won't name names or the property, but they were marketing something as such with adjacency to public lands. And there was this right of way for public lands, to get to the forest through the property on a short corner. And the seller agent didn't really market that effectively. And the buyer agent didn't catch that in the title, that there was this right of way for the forest easement. And there was all of this,
right.
There was some legalities that happened after that. So to your point, the due diligence before even going under contract, but then the review process with your broker is super important. Like I alluded to before, a lot of us will buy cars, a lot of us will buy houses, but maybe buy ranches once in a lifetime. And so you might not really know the ins and outs of title, but there are these exceptions that you've been talking about that we really need to focus on. And that review process, there's typically tops maybe 14 days to review title. So as a broker, it's super important to just kind of go through that with a fine tooth comb with your clients and really make sure they understand what all of those encumbrances are that are shown in the title commitment. So that review process and that due diligence process is super important, and very different in ranch real estate than any other real estate. So that's big.
No doubt. And it's a biggie, right? And I appreciate your perspective on all of that, because, understanding what, you go through with your buyers helps us understand and hopefully be more efficient with our responses to if there's an objection to title, or to what are those exceptions that need to be modified. And then, in terms of title, most people say, well, how do you guys determine the price of title? And unfortunately, it's a very easy answer here in the state of Colorado. We file our rates with the Colorado Division of Insurance, and any increases must be justified through higher costs. And I'll tell you, there's no discounts, even for me or my family. Even you're a friend, I can't give you a discount. And so it is what it is. And it's not negotiable. Like I know in other states, like Illinois, for example, it's an attorney-driven state, and those rates are somewhat negotiable. And so nothing is based upon volume or tiers of liability amounts or sales prices. our rates are based upon that liability amount, but discounts aren't applied as a result of those. So,
Okay.
um,
So as a
yeah,
larger
it's pretty cut and
landowner,
dry.
that's a good thing, right? Like you're
Yeah.
going to just get just as much coverage as this person for just the same amount.
Well, the liability amount goes up, so the costs go up because we essentially have a higher liability with a $50 million ranch than we
Right.
have with a $2 million ranch, right?
Mhm.
So there's coverage of 50 million instead of 2 million. So, but what I'm saying is that there are discounts apply to, the larger transactions. It's
Got
just
it.
what it
Okay.
is.
Awesome. But and that's interesting to know that I know you were talking like Texas is also, is that what you're saying, an attorney driven? So
It
another
is.
difference between Colorado and some of these Intermountain states than other places. And
Mhm.
why title companies are very important here as compared to other places.
Mhm.
And then with that, what type of contracts then are you accepting? I know we alluded to kind of in the process that once you get the contract, that's kind of how you determine next steps and all of these different stages. But what type of contracts do you all accept at Land Title specifically?
Yeah, there's two big categories. The standard contract, which is, we abide by the Colorado provided by the Department of Regulatory Agencies, or DORA is what we call
Okay.
it here. And that's online and available to the public, which is what, a lot of people use in these
Mhm.
transactions. And then there's non-standard contracts, which are usually contracts drafted by attorneys. And so we abide by both. And a little known fact, we can actually literally accept a napkin with very little information, like buyer and seller, address / legal description. Most people writing on a napkin wouldn't have the legal address, as you can imagine, but maybe the address or the name of the ranch, sales price, and it needs to be signed. And nowadays the rest can be really done through email because we have written record and exchanges and what things are agreed upon in terms of like tax prorations, and if there's grazing leases and how to prorate those leases and all of that. Now, something on a napkin might require 100 emails going back and forth agreed upon, because and we would advise to use Mer Ranch Group and actually go through a proper process and agree to terms up front, so there's no issues within the process. But as I think through this and was talking to one of our managers, I just think of a couple of old Western guys sitting at a saloon having a bourbon and negotiating a sales contract and writing it down on a napkin and shaking hands and signing a napkin and that's it, right?
Yeah,
In the
that's
old
how title
West.
was
So
created in the Old
that's right.
West.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
So
No, it's really amazing what you guys do, and I think it's crucial for land stewards to really know the ins and outs of title, because it really is about conveying the land that you've either loved for so long correctly and ensuring that land, but then understanding it too. I mean, there's so many things about the West and adjacent parcels, and like you said, the railroads crossing, that also offers like this perspective of history of your land and how it's been used in the past. So it's beyond just a tool. It's also like a tool to know more about the piece that you're owning. So
no doubt.
I like to romanticize title in that way too.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's
Yeah.
very neat. And it is neat when, I go upstairs and like we'll see the title officer actually going through literally on a piece of paper the chain of title and seeing some of the names associated with ownership, especially with some of the areas in the mountains that we all like and love, and the families that settled there first. So it is really neat, especially for the history buffs among us.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Erik. I really appreciate you taking the time. And we've valued your friendship, but also just working with you through the years, because I know we've sent you sometimes like 3 contracts in a day, and you've been able to figure it out and get title for us when we needed it. So thank you so much for everything you do, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Haley, and thank you to Ken. I'm sorry he has, he's stuck in Florida this week,
Yeah.
under the weather of the times, so to say. But certainly, Land Title appreciates our partnership with Mer Ranch Group. We like working with you all and working through these transactions. So thank you for everything that you do for Land Title.
Thanks. And we'll see you potentially on Thursday.
Sounds great.
All
Thanks
right.
so much.
Thanks,
Bye
Erik.
now.
See you next time. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. I know we covered a lot. As I said, title can get very confusing, and land title and Mer Ranch Group is here to help. So if you have any other questions about title or the process, please feel free to reach out to Land Title or Erik. And if you have any other questions about the ranch real estate market, please don't hesitate to call Mer Ranch Group or subscribe to our newsletter on our website at www.merranchgroup.com, or give us a call at 303-623-4545. Thanks so much. See you next time.